We're so happy to have Aaron Ra here. He's such an important figure in our local politics, local science advocacy, and the difference between fact and fiction. It's such an important concept. So he's here to support us, and please welcome Aaron Ra.
Thank you very much, everyone. Right, I normally focus on the conflict of science versus superstition, particularly defending evolution against creationism. And I want to give some backdrop on that because it's immediately relevant to what we're talking about today. I became an activist shortly before Y2K when I became aware of the Wedge strategy. And that was literally a conspiracy of a handful of religious extremists whose ultimate goal was to undermine and overthrow our secular democratic republic and institute theocracy in its stead. What type of theocracy that would be varied according to the source. I was most concerned with Reconstructionists like Rousas Rushdoony of the Chalcedon Institute, who wanted to revise the United States to be an overtly Christian country, one that would even enforce Levitical law. I'm going to turn this off. Kill that. All right, so if you think Sharia law is bad, read Leviticus. Where every law is religious, where slavery would be reinstated, and execution is the typical punishment for virtually everything, and you could be executed even for working on weekends. And as outrageous as that sounds, back in Y2K, there were several federal legislators that were already elected who were connected with the Chalcedon Institute, so they were making progress.
That's that other line.
Yeah.
I don't know, put that up there.
So Christian dominionism seeks to have Christians rule the world from the Oval Office. The plan of how to achieve that goal was detailed in a memo written by intelligent design creationists at the Discovery Institute and accidentally leaked to the public in 1998. That document said that the goal of the Wedge strategy was to change American culture by shaping public policy to reflect politically conservative, fundamentalist, evangelical Protestant values. The plan was called a wedge because it was meant to be a small group of religiously biased academics attempting to use the credentials of their scholarship to drive a wedge between and split mainstream academia on certain key issues, the most obvious of which was, of course, science. The very beginning of this strategy, the thin edge of the wedge, was said to be attorney Philip Johnson's book, Darwinism on Trial, published in 1991, and followed by a number of other authors of the Discovery Institute writing similar distortions of and objections to evolution, which they misrepresent as Darwinism to make it seem like just another religious belief rather than a matter of verifiable fact. The goal was not just to refute evolution, though. The real target was materialism, the entire scientific perspective in principle and practice. Specifically, methodological naturalism, the scientific method requiring that all scientific explanations had to be testable, repeatable, verifiable, and demonstrably accurate. Creationists don't like that because they want blind speculation about magical miracles to be acceptable as science. As if it's not about the facts, it's about whatever you want to believe. Because in religion, it doesn't matter what's really true as long as it is believed to be true. And sometimes they'll admit that they'll even make believe when they know it's not true. The Wedge document detailed a 20-year plan based on the success of a 5-year initial plan. Phase 1 was an attempt to undermine science from within. Phase 2 was to seek publicity through all available media, including teaching every preacher anti-science arguments at apologetic seminars, producing pseudoscience documentaries and educational science channels, and distributing deceptively worded petitions and quote mines of actual scientists in an attempt to spread the false impression that there was a scientific descent from Darwinism. Phase 3 was meant to culminate in a high-profile court case which they thought would establish intelligent design creationism as the dominant scientific theory because they didn't understand what a scientific theory was. They expected a ruling for creationism and against materialism because they'd already spent more than a decade in a concentrated effort with a coalition of church congregations voting together as a bloc exactly as associated ministers collectively agreed and illegally instructed to position evangelical judges and senators and school board members and so on, so that right-wing religious extremists dominate every level of state and federal government all across the country. That's how and why it is that ignorant, bigoted, theocratic defenders of the faith rule everything in this country now. However, despite this, and much to their surprise, when Kitzmiller versus Dover finally happened, all according to their plan, albeit 7 years later, they hadn't planned on a right-wing Republican Bush-appointed conservative Christian judge to rule intelligently, honestly, and fairly on the side of science. With that one ruling, their 5-year plan ultimately failed. Their 20-year plan, laid out 21 years ago, to establish creationism as the dominant theory throughout all of science and to see it permeate religious, cultural, moral, and political life, has also failed. However, Christian nationalists are relentless. They will never give up, so they conspired to come up with a different plan, one which was implemented just last year in 2018, but still has the same ultimate goal as the Wedge strategy did. According to Americans United for Separation of Church and State, the new plan, called Project Blitz, is a coordinated national effort to codify a far-right evangelical Christian America. The project is called a Blitz because the strategy is to flood state legislatures with so many of these bills that at least some of them would likely pass. The effort was coordinated by a number of Christian groups, including the Congressional Prayer Caucus Foundation, which claims 600 politicians in state legislatures around the country as members. The result thus far is that 76 bills have already been issued in 26 states just in the last year, some of which use verbatim language taken from the playbook or have otherwise identical intent. Project Blitz is a 116-page strategy manual including model bills that, if any are passed in legislation, are intended to protect religious freedom, preserve America's Judeo-Christian heritage, and promote prayer, while also utterly destroying the wall of separation between church and state and thus converting our democracy to theocracy. Now, promoting prayer may seem no worse than wishing on a star and hoping your wish will come true, but it's worse than that. It's talking to your magic imaginary friend until you convince yourself that someone is really listening. This happens no matter what God it is. It could even be your spirit totem, the ghost of a dead relative, an astral projection transcendentalist, or telepathic transmissions from extraterrestrial reptiles. It could even be an inanimate object, like an idol, or a sculpture of your God, or perhaps a soccer ball with a bloody handprint on it. If you talk to any imaginary character long enough, it will start talking back. If you meditate on any mysticism devoid of skeptical analysis, you can leave your body and not realize that you're only dreaming, or you can read someone else's mind to know what they're not really thinking, or you could even remember past lives that you didn't really live, though you may now think you did. So promoting prayer is the most important part of instilling and maintaining this type of auto-deceptive, self-satisfying delusion necessary to get people to protect, promote, and perpetuate such irrational faith in others as well, and thus serve the dominant politically religious faction. It's not about revealing any spiritual truth. There is no truth to any religion. It's all about manipulating the masses. Our allegedly Judeo-Christian heritage is a fantasy, because there's no such thing as a Judeo-Christian anything. That word artificially fuses two fundamentally disparate ideologies. Those who want to preserve this culture are only concerned with the Christian part. Jews be damned. Literally. The idea of preserving any one culture is at least ethnocentric, if not racist, and one culture can only be preserved by excluding or distancing others and refusing to allow any integration. But the United States was founded as a melting pot of multiple cultures where the state has no religion, and the founders were explicit about that, saying that Congress shall make no law even respecting an establishment of religion. The idea of protecting religious freedom is actually the greatest threat behind Project Blitz, because the plan is to weaponize religious freedom, to impose Christianity on American public, political, and cultural life, and to literally demonize any politician who dares try to oppose any of these bills, such that doing the right thing becomes political suicide, being spun as if one is opposed to freedom or heritage. Like the Wedge strategy, Project Blitz has 3 phases. Category 1 is mostly symbolic. These are the bills that are trying to get "In God We Trust" stamped on every school and government building to perpetuate the illusion that we were founded as a Christian country. Category 2 are the Christian bills, allowing specific privileges to that one religion, which could then be used as precedents for subsequent bills to teach Christianity in public schools, thus incrementally violating the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. Category 3 are the anti-everyone else bills, violating the Prohibition Clause of the First Amendment, and these include the imposition of biblical values concerning the marriage and sexuality. The intended outcome of those is to allow employers, businesses, child care providers, and so on to discriminate against queer folk and anyone else they disapprove of in defense of their claim of sincerely held religious beliefs. And one of the guiding hands behind Project Blitz is David Barton, an evangelical nutjob with a history of promoting dishonest propaganda, like quoting things the Founding Fathers never said, for example. Barton is a historical revisionist who wants to rebuild our nation's foundations out of fiction, ignoring the actual establishment as the first ever secular government. Because the founders of this country knew that religion is exclusively supported by lies and is literally nothing but lies, and will use underhanded schemes to achieve dominance at the expense of the very freedoms they only pretend to defend. Project Blitz is actually more dangerous than the Wedge strategy, because now that the Supreme Court has been stacked with a theocratic majority, it is no longer a reasonable arbiter of just legislation. Ecclesiastical prejudice will prevail over any issue where faith in any of the justices could be implicated and either called upon or challenged, no matter how unjust or how unconstitutional those rulings objectively are. This gives Christian dominionists an advantage, enabling them even to undermine the Constitution through their contrived interpretations favoring faith. We've already seen that with the recent ruling that a monumental symbol of Christianity is somehow secular, when we all know better. Now, some say that proclaiming trust in God isn't necessarily Christian either, that it could be treated as no more than ceremonial deism, even though we know that's a lie, because we've already heard from Christian coalitions bragging that they are using that slogan to Christianize our country. Another problem is that this country is actually less Christian all the time. Over the last few years, atheism has been on the rise in all 50 states as the fastest growing demographic, while Christianity has been in a general state of decline worldwide. Years ago, we outnumbered Catholics. Earlier this year, we outpaced Protestants, and that trend will continue as religion continues to impede, retard, or reverse progress in every application except for the victimization of children and perpetuation of ignorance, hypocrisy, and prejudicial bigotry promoted as righteous values. Roughly a quarter of all Americans and more than a third of those under 30 identify as irreligious unbelievers, and they are statistically staying that way. Even the elderly are discarding their faith, whether because of increased understanding of science or increasingly obvious criminality of the clergy, or simply because they read the Bible and realized what a crock of already falsified fairy tales that is and always was. To say nothing of the failure of prayer, or the religious agenda to take advantage of the needy, to mislead and deceive, to spread hatred and deny demonstrable realities at our collective peril, while enriching themselves at our expense, tax-free. So why do they own and control everything? Because they vote. And the only way to beat them is to outvote them. And anyone who tells you different is either stupid and shouldn't be giving advice, or is working for the other side and not for your interests. We already represent a significant portion of the population who do not trust in any God. The national motto should represent all of us, not just a diminishing fraction who are thankfully dying out. That's why we should return to the original motto and get this embarrassing, superstitious blemish off our money. That, of course, was not the original motto, and sometimes it seems that only atheist activists even know that our original, because the nation was founded on Greco-Roman democratic philosophy rather than anything biblical, our motto was originally E pluribus unum, which is Latin for out of many, one. This shows the multicultural melting pot we were intended to be, not the Judeo-Christian fantasy that never was, but has been foisted upon us by the false doctrine of American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism is the lie that the United States was founded as a Christian country and based on a covenant between God and Moses, and that as a result, our country is magically blessed by God. To quote Dr. Emil Lester, historian and professor of political science at the University of Virginia, there is no evidence that the Founding Fathers had Moses in mind when drafting the Constitution. In fact, 2 letters to Thomas Jefferson, John Adams openly denied that the 10 Commandments were the basis of our Constitution or legal system, end quote. And I could go on and on about how many of the Founding Fathers were not Christian themselves, and even those who were still refused to allow religious practice or involvement in the legislative process because they knew that every time that religion has ever had rule over law, the result has always been an almost automatic violation of human rights. If Moses was a real person, which he evidently wasn't, he would have strongly objected to every aspect of the constitutional liberties we enjoy, being the exactly opposite of the type of government that is commonly associated with Moses, which we would consider unimaginable and unbearable. The once noble, inspirational, original motto of E pluribus unum, pardon my Latin sucks, was changed to the wholly inappropriate reference to the Christian God as a reaction to the Red Scare of godless communism in the 1950s. Since then, that newly revised and divisive slogan has been used by the Wedge strategy, by Project Blitz, and by American exceptionalism to Christianize our once secular state. Trying to force the rest of us to trust in God is and has been part of the same ongoing culture war between conservatives and progressives that has been raging since this country was founded. Because the wanna-believers could never accept or understand the value behind secularism, the only type of government that even can provide freedom of religion, because that's not possible without freedom from religion too, meaning that those of different faiths or of no faith don't have to show reverence to the declared faith of the state. Having a state religion means that everyone else is a second-class citizen, subject to that faith, and maybe even criminalized by it. And we've already seen that every such government has been dangerous, irrational, and inhumane because faith will not listen to reason. And that's my piece. Thank you very much.
All right.